Welcome everybody to the third of four courses in August. We've been looking at the various connections between population and climate change. So I think most of you are well aware by now, but in case we have any newcomers, Population Connection is a US-based nonprofit organization. We do a lot of education and outreach surrounding the concepts of population growth and their connections to access to comprehensive healthcare, and environmental sustainability. We also, as an organization, advocate for increased US funding for family planning programs internationally. And today's class is going to be looking at the influence of human activities on pandemics. All right, so over the past 2 weeks, we've been learning about the ways that population influences and is influenced by climate change. And we've been discussing how population growth both contributes to climate change, especially given the projected demographic trends that will occur in the next 30 to 70 years, which will drastically increase standards of living and consumption patterns for the world's quickly growing middle income countries, in which 5 billion people currently reside. And we've also looked at the connections between fertility rates, poverty, and climate vulnerability, noting that many of the world's fastest growing regions are also the most vulnerable to climate change. And this has to do with many different factors, with geography, of course, but also with socioeconomic status measured at all levels of society. And last week, we looked at the injustices associated with climate impacts and environmental health, using the term climate justice to help further explain the disproportionate effects of climate change across the world, and to help understand climate impacts and environmental health as political issues reflective of extensive histories of colonization, exclusion, racism, and oppression. Our discussion made clear the fact that solving climate change must involve grassroots leadership and be rooted in human rights and social justice initiatives. And here, very quickly, I just want to take a moment to clarify something, because we've been talking a lot about poverty and high fertility and low-income countries. And I just want to make clear that the reason why many poor countries have high fertility rates is largely because of a lack of structural support at the state level. So when I'm talking about populations that experience a lack of access to resources like education or healthcare or economic opportunity, I'm largely referring to an overall lack of social safety and security by governments. Fertility rates are high in poor regions because overall health and life expectancy is quite low. And the assumption there is that it's advantageous to have many children because not all will survive, and because they are needed to help with household labor and things like that. So when public services and utilities like running water are put into communities, and when labor conditions improve, and when social safety nets increase, then fertility rates can start to drop naturally. And again, this has a lot to do with government support. I don't ever mean to infer that poverty is in any way preventable for most people. Rather, I'd argue that most people around the world are trying to survive in some of the most dire of circumstances that they experience through no fault of their own. And we're talking about all of these issues in such a macro and global context and scale that I think it's difficult not to generalize. But I wanted to make that point just before we go any further. And if you'd like to talk about specifics, I'd be happy to do so after the presentation. Okay, so today's talk actually dovetails off of those discussions, but focuses more on the ecological effects of population and climate change, and in particular, the increasing likelihood of zoonotic disease emergence. And so here I'm going to institute my first poll, which is a true and false question, asking if COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease, true or false. And so go ahead and answer. I'm not going to define what a zoonotic disease is just yet, but just to get everybody kind of rolling here. All right, we'll give everyone about 10 more seconds. So if you haven't submitted your answer, please do so. We have about 10 people who haven't. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So most of you got this right. The answer is true. COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. And so as we start off today, I want to take this opportunity to look at the underlying causes of COVID-19, which is of course the most influential pandemic of our time, because they have direct links to population and in particular habitat destruction. And as we're all well aware, COVID-19 has become a global pandemic and is affecting all of us in ways that I think previously were difficult for many of us to imagine. But scientists have been predicting this for a really long time and contend that this is not the only pandemic that we're going to experience in our lifetimes, due mainly to the fact that we interact with the environment in specific ways that are detrimental and that increase the likelihood of pathogen spillover. And so here I'm going to institute my second poll, asking where COVID-19 came from. So this is a multiple choice question, and I'm asking where COVID-19 originated in. Was it a lab, ice cores, a CAFO, or from bats? So take a few minutes to submit your answer. All right, about 10 seconds. All right, I'm gonna end the poll. Looks like the majority of you again got this question right. Yes, so it originated in bats. So scientists, let me stop sharing here. So scientists maintain that COVID-19 has an ecological origin in bat populations and was therefore transferred to humans through some direct or indirect interactions with bats. And so yes, COVID-19 is the latest zoonotic disease, which means that it was transferred to humans via an animal, in this case a bat. Other examples of zoonotic diseases that you're likely familiar with include Ebola, SARS, MERS, and AIDS, among many others. But what I'd like us to start thinking about as we get into today's discussion is the fact that in investigating the underlying conditions that allow for these transfers between animals and humans to occur, scientists are continuously arguing that animals, despite being disease-carrying vectors, have much less to do with the likelihood of disease outbreaks in humans than humans do themselves. And just for reference, I've listed some well-known zoonotic diseases and their animal origins. And it's important to note that scientists maintain that about 75% of new infectious diseases are zoonotic, or a direct result of human-to-animal interaction. And these slides will be posted after class today in case any of you would like to reference this later. And it's no surprise that, animals carry viruses, as they always have. However, factors such as a massive global market for wild animals, as well as agricultural intensification or industrialized agriculture, as well as deforestation and urbanization, are bringing humans into closer and closer contact with animals, giving way for viruses to infect us more easily. Again, about 75% of emerging infectious diseases in humans have a zoonotic origin, and nearly 1.7 million undiscovered viruses may still exist in wildlife. And as researchers continue to search for those pathogens that will cause the next animal to human spillover, the world's likeliest hotspots have three major things in common. One, lots of people, so high population density. Two, diverse plants and animals, so a really biodiverse and ecologically dense, usually tropical region. And three, rapid environmental changes brought about by land use patterns, as well as climate change. So again, as we continue to move through this presentation, it's important to remember how relevant both population growth and a changing climate are in understanding and ultimately preventing the next outbreak. And so one of the ways that we as humans are endangering ourselves is by encroaching further and further into the native habitats of disease hosts like bats. So bats are really important for biodiversity and ecosystem sustainability. They play a major role in sustaining ecosystem health, but they also act as some of the world's primary virus vessels. And in part, this has to do with their super strong immune systems. But bats are carriers of many pathogens that don't actually make them sick, but that could be deadly if transferred to humans. And of course, humans are now increasing the likelihood of this pathogen transfer happening. And so we know now that humans are perpetuating the risk of future zoonotic disease outbreaks, but how exactly? Well, there are several different ways in which this happens. And the first and primary one is the ever expanding market for exotic wildlife trade, especially at what are known as wet markets, where many different animals are crowded together and sold, sometimes illicitly for consumption, trade, or otherwise. Exotic meat sales are becoming more and more popular in the world's quickly growing megacities, defined as a city with more than 10 million people. And the second is through intensified agriculture. And while much attention has been paid to wet markets as being the culprit for zoonotic disease emergence, industrialized agriculture, which is much more common in the United States, is also very much to blame. Industrialized agriculture involves processes that crowd livestock together in small, unsanitary spaces. The use of antibiotics and hormones to help prevent animals from getting sick in such conditions and to promote unnaturally fast growth is also common. And in these settings, the pesticides used to grow corn and other crops to feed livestock also contributes to biodiversity loss, which increases the chance of disease emergence. In fact, since 1940, 25% of all communicable diseases that were transferred to humans have been linked to intensive agriculture. Mad cow disease is one example. Bird flu is another, a new strain of which has just recently emerged in a factory turkey farm in South Carolina. And all of this has to do with the crowding of animals into tight spaces that are unsanitary, keeping them in really harsh conditions, feeding them foods that are unnatural and unsafe to eat. The list goes on. Essentially, the point is that animal abuse is very tightly linked to pathogen spillover and spread. And the third is through habitat destruction, which is directly correlated with population growth, of course, because as the world's population continues to grow, urban and rural developments will spread further and further into previously untouched habitats, disrupting ecosystems and destroying wildlife habitats. So over time, this reduces the number of predators, and without predators, the amount of rodents and other disease carriers increases substantially. And to help illustrate this, I'm going to take us through a few examples. And the first is the Nipah virus, which can materialize as an acute respiratory disease in humans and animals. It was discovered in 1998 in Malaysia and has since spread throughout Asia and was transferred to humans because of environmental change and agricultural intensification. So in this case, when rainforests were cleared and repurposed to produce cash crops and raise livestock, native fruit bat populations were forced from their natural habitat. It's believed that some fled to areas surrounding pig farms because of the presence of mango and other fruit trees. Eventually, the disease was transferred from bat feces and saliva to the pigs, who then spread the virus to farm and industry workers. And again, the point here being that humans have engaged in habitat destruction and ecosystem disruption that allowed for these interactions to take place and essentially caused the animal to human spillover. And of course, we've been talking a lot about the continued growth of the population, but scientists are only saying that animal to human interaction is going to increase. And that is in large part to do with the fact that our population is growing significantly. Again, the world population has increased from 1 billion people in 1800 to 7.8 billion people today. And while projections vary and are highly contingent on whether or not we innovate in things like family planning and other developmental solutions, the UN does project with 95% certainty that around there will be about 8.5 billion people in 2030, 9.7 in 2050, and 10.9 billion in 2100. And ultimately, what we need to contend with is the fact that there are many complex and interconnected challenges contributing to the likelihood of zoonotic disease transfer and the propensity of future pandemics. And in many ways, the very structure of our capitalist world economy as it has developed, at least since the Industrial Revolution, endangers us, as it has conventionally encouraged economies of scale type of production and consumption of fossil fuels that cause climate change, of commodities that fuel deforestation, of meat, all processes that threaten the health and well-being of humans everywhere. And again, I want to help illustrate this by looking at an example, this time from the Brazilian Amazon, where deforestation is increasing substantially. So the rainforest here has recently been opened again for loggers, ranchers, and miners, which has caused large-scale forest clearance, thereby creating the conditions necessary for large wildfires. And even while restrictions have become less of an inhibitor recently, many believe that illegal logging and mining hasn't ever stopped, even during the COVID-19 lockdown. And this is obviously increasing environmental degradation and biodiversity loss, but it's also affecting indigenous populations who live in the Amazon rainforests and who would otherwise be isolated enough to likely never encounter the virus. What's worse, smoke from wildfires increases the likelihood of dying from COVID-19, which of course attacks the respiratory system. And this is being described by many as a genocide of sorts, as fragile Native communities are being exposed to a virus through illegal means that they have no protections against. Many communities are at risk now of being wiped out entirely. And Brazil, in order to combat this, has made a point of deploying armed forces to stop deforestation and wildfires, but many are skeptical of the plan's efficacy in the long term. And also at the same time, the Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, has continued to weaken or eliminate environmental regulations and the institutions enforcing them. So the president and his administration are also simultaneously creating laws that would allow for ownership of illegally deforested land occupied before 2018, which is effectively promoting continued invasion into the Amazon region. And as a consequence, deforestation is increasing in much of the Amazon's public areas that are not officially protected or marked as indigenous land. Unprotected forests accounted for 46% of registered deforestation in just the first quarter of 2020 alone, which is an increase of 30% from 2019. So this problem is escalating very quickly and could be devastating for the rainforest and also the animals, both human and non-human, who inhabit it. So deforestation, in particular in the Amazon, which is of course the world's largest rainforest, is also a major contributor to climate change because forests store and soak up large amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere as they grow. When forests are cleared, the carbon that was once stored in the trees and in the soil is released into the atmosphere in the form of CO2, which is one of the primary greenhouse gases accelerating climate change. From 2015 to 2017 alone, the global loss of tropical forests released about 4.8 billion tons of CO2 per year, which accounted for about 10% of annual CO2 emissions produced by humans. And so in order to really get to the bottom of these issues here, I think it's really important to try to understand things from a political economy perspective, which will help elucidate many of the main drivers of environmental degradation in geopolitical terms. And in fact, the global approach to the production of goods has a lot to do with issues related to deforestation, habitat destruction, intensified agricultural practices, and so on. So from a geopolitical perspective, studies have shown that the production of goods that are traded on the world market actually cause a higher level of resource depletion in lower income countries than in higher income countries. And this is largely because of the production of cash crops, or crops that are produced for commercial sale rather than personal consumption, that typically involve deforestation and cause biodiversity loss, as large swaths of land and forests are cleared to make way for large-scale production of a single crop, or monoculture, as is pictured here in the slide. And as we know, these are the very processes that also increase the risk of viral spillover. So globally, some of the main regions where key agricultural products like beef, coffee, cocoa, and palm oil are produced include sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, which of course are some of the fastest growing regions in the world. These regions are also export-led, meaning that the majority of crops produced in low-income countries are shipped and sold to high-income countries who consume the good. For instance, over 95% of the coffee and cocoa produced in developing regions are exported to North America and Europe. And in Brazil, for example, the agricultural industry is extremely important to the country's economy and employs over 10% of its workforce. Because the country is a leading producer of cash crops like coffee and sugar, there is a really large incentive to augment production practices, which may be good economically, but that put a lot of pressure on the environment. About 70% of Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture and deforestation. And so in ecological terms, large-scale habitat destruction and deforestation also lead to species extinction, usually of large predatory animals first. And this, again, gives way to the world's most common vectors like bats, rats, and mosquitoes to roam freely without the threat of predators. So the confluence of human population growth and habitat destruction and land use strategies push vectors further and further into communities and other urban areas, again, increasing the likelihood of animal to human interaction. And so as we're starting to think about solutions to these massive global issues, we should be paying a lot of attention to geopolitics and economic incentives, and ultimately to the structure of our world economy. Deforestation is driven largely by economic demands, but conventional practices and economies of scale types of techniques are increasing the risk of future pandemics and contributing to climate change. Climate change is also now emerging as a driver of infectious disease, whether by expanding the footprint of disease-carrying vectors like mosquitoes, or by defrosting prehistoric pathogens from the Siberian permafrost, or by increasing wildfires and extreme weather events. The list goes on. Clearly, we need to change the way we're operating. And through our experience with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think one thing has been made really clear, and that is when we destroy nature and abuse animals, we are endangering ourselves. So there's a really critical relationship between a healthy environment and healthy people, and how human activities often undermine the long-term health and ability of ecosystems to support human well-being, to the detriment, of course, to our own species. And of course, again, these issues, we're talking about things in such a global macro scope, they're incredibly complex and difficult to even fathom, much less develop solutions for. However, it's quite clear, again, that we need to make some really large changes. So any solutions we come up with must involve a structural shift in economic and ecological terms. And one solution that has gained some prominence, especially recently, is called a OneHealth solution. And the goal of this approach is to increase health outcomes by better understanding the interconnections between humans, animals, plants, and their shared environment. So understanding, again, how best to work in accordance with natural systems rather than in opposition to them, which again has proven to work to the detriment of humanity and Earth's natural systems. Essentially, it's the idea that the health of people is connected to the health of animals and our shared environment. So when we work to protect one, we're protecting all. And while this solution is kind of broad and likely best approached situationally, the UN has put forth a few recommendations for countries to incorporate into their development plans and economic structures, including the direct investment in integrated solutions that simultaneously address several societal and environmental issues, the expansion of scientific research into zoonotic diseases and pandemic prevention strategies, education about the connections between zoonotic disease emergence and human activities, the investment in sustainable land management practices, and developing alternatives for food security and livelihoods that do not rely on the destruction of habitats and biodiversity. And so as we start to wrap up here, I wanted to end by looking at the synergies between this pandemic and climate change, with the hopes of helping to better convey the urgency with which we need to be approaching climate solutions, although I'm sure that I'm preaching to the choir here. So both COVID-19 and climate change are global in scope and will affect everyone, with the world's most marginalized populations being the most vulnerable and feeling the most severe effects. Both will require large-scale government intervention and response, including help with economic transitioning. And both have tipping points, importantly, meaning that if we wait too long, a cascade of effects will result, and the effectiveness of our solutions up until a certain point, will not be near as impactful. So this graph has become quite popular in helping us to understand the scope and severity of COVID-19, and shows what we would have needed to do in order to flatten the curve or prevent a surge in new cases that would overwhelm healthcare systems. This, of course, didn't happen in most places, but if we had been able to stay below the curve by staying at home and preventing future outbreaks, we would have prevented the widespread and largely uncontrollable increases in new cases, and our healthcare system would have been able to manage and adapt much more readily. While this hasn't happened in the US, other countries like New Zealand and South Korea have been successful in flattening the curve and controlling the virus. And similarly, I think it would be helpful to view the potential effects of climate change in terms of our capacity to limit and prevent future temperature increases. So this graph is by no means perfect. It's meant more to be a metaphorical representation of the potential dangers associated with resisting climate actions. So the graph goes, if we continue business as usual and emit unsustainable amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we will reach a tipping point and therefore be unable to stop the compounding climate effects. But if we stay below the climate curve, and which is in this case is the Paris Agreement, in which countries have agreed to work to prevent temperature increases of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we will be able to manage and to a certain extent control or contain climate impacts. This means that we need to be doing everything possible in order to stop this climate crisis before it's too late. And so final thoughts here. Again, this has been a presentation about the influence of human activities on pandemics. We've learned that zoonotic disease emergence is linked to human population growth, to habitat destruction, wildlife trade, agriculture, antimicrobial resistance, and deforestation. And in order to prevent the next pandemic, humans must reduce our impact on plants, animals, and the living environment. A greater understanding of the interconnections between human health and ecosystem health must be integrated into our social, political, and economic systems. And I'm just going to end with this quote that was given by Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, who's a professor at George Mason University. And it says, "Nature sustains us. It's where we originated. The lesson from this pandemic is to not be afraid of nature, but rather to restore it, embrace it, and understand how to live with and benefit from it." All right, you can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Hannah. That was fabulous. We have started to get some questions. We've got a few so far, so I'll just start running through them. First, what is the best methodology to get states, I guess countries, and powerful NGOs to take populations seriously?
What is the best method?
Yeah, I guess so. What's the best way to get countries and NGOs to take population seriously?
Well, I think that education just plays a really crucial role. I think that as we talked about in the first and to a lesser extent in the second class as well, population as it relates to the environment has been a really contentious issue. And there are reasons for that that are totally legitimate, but I think because of that, it's sort of lost popularity in environmental circles and large institutions that focus on environmental issues in the NGO sector and even in the public sector, looking at things like the UN, have been really reluctant to incorporate this. But again, I think that the sort of aversions associated with population and environment studies should be obsolete if looked at in a particular way. What we're advocating for are human rights and access to resources and ensuring everybody has the ability to live a comfortable and sustainable life. And the consequences of not implementing these solutions are really dire, not only in societal terms, but also in environmental terms as well. So I think the connections between population health and the environment really need to be made clear, and a sort of re-education of the associations between population growth and the environment need to be highlighted as well.
For sure. And one thing that I will mention is that most developing countries that have high population growth and high fertility do have population policies and do recognize population growth as a hindrance to the sustainable development goals and stuff that they want to reach. So it might not be something that we hear about a lot in the United States, but it is something that is being talked about in the settings that have rapid population growth. Okay. What else do we have here? I mean, people are worried about drinking coffee. We have somebody who says, if coffee crops are contributing to climate change, can we work with companies such as Starbucks or Coffee Bean to address this? And somebody else wrote, should I stop drinking coffee?
Well, I think it's important to be a really conscious consumer. I think that in the United States, we are, driving the demand for these products that are, contributing to ecological collapse, to, oppression of people, and to exploitation of the environment and of people. So I think it's really important to look at and be conscious about what we're purchasing. And although certifications aren't perfect, they are one way of kind of consuming in a way that can sort of maintain sustainability in some sense. But I think this problem is much bigger than even that. I think that in environmental terms, a lot of people kind of blame consumers for this problem of climate change and these issues of inequality, but it really has a lot to do with the economic structure that we've put in place, whereby countries are producing goods on a massive scale. They're producing, either a single or, a few different cash crops for sale in the global market in exchange for money that they can then use to buy food. Like the whole system in and of itself is fairly unsustainable, right? And it doesn't take into account the ecological feedbacks or incentives that the surrounding environments would otherwise provide, if that makes sense. So I think it requires both conscious consuming and a willingness to re-envision what our economic structures look like for future generations.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing here in the chat that Gladys Kalema-Zikusoka, who's the founder and CEO of Conservation Through Public Health, who spoke to us last month, she says you should try and drink sustainably sourced coffee as it will help smallholder farmers and can also support conservation. And
yes,
she knows because CTPH actually produces coffee. That's one of their programs. So if you're interested in buying some sustainably produced coffee, go check out ctph.org and order some of theirs. They're in Uganda. Thanks, Gladys. Mm-hmm. Okay, what else do we have here? Okay, somebody says, can you give some more ideas of how we can translate this into local action on the scale needed?
Translate what?
Well, that's a good question. I assume just some of maybe the OneHealth approach.
Oh,
let's go with that.
Well, in sort of localized settings, again, CTPH, Dr. Gladys, is a perfect example of an organization that has utilized this OneHealth approach. And we've been talking about this in other sessions as well, but essentially what it looks at is the broader picture of things and recognizes that environmental degradation is the consequence of other sort of social indicators, like perhaps poverty or lack of access to economic alternatives or lack of education. And so the OneHealth approach and the approach that CTPH is using looks at innovations in public health as a way of increasing livelihoods for communities that surround gorilla habitats in Uganda that were endangered as a consequence of habitat destruction, and develop solutions that benefit both the gorillas and people. I don't know, Marian, if you want to expand a little bit on that.
I mean,
but I think that
I don't know any more than you do about that. That sounds good to me.
Yeah, but I think in recognizing these solutions, they have to be integrated, right? They have to tackle more than one issue. We can't just look at environmental conservation. We can't just look at access to healthcare. They have to be integrated. They have to include both human, environmental, and social equity, which I think is the sort of premise behind sustainability anyway.
Yeah. Somebody here is asking whether we have a voter education program. So it's a complicated answer because Population Connection is a 501c3 organization, and that tax designation does not allow us to work on any electoral or partisan politics, but it does allow us to engage people in getting out the vote and registering to vote. So yes, we are, we're working with activists on the ground around the country to get their their communities registered to vote. That is something that we are very invested in this season, especially. Okay, what is CCTH? CTPH maybe is what they're asking. It was mentioned while describing the OneHealth approach. I guess you just answered that. What else do we have? What is happening in the Amazon is alarming. What is the next quick solution available to save it and its inhabitants?
Quick solution. Well, yeah, I think that's kind of the ultimate issue, right? Is because these issues are incredibly complex, and it's difficult to just go in and have a, panacea of solutions, right? But I think that, again, it does require a sort of re-envisioning of economic incentives. Deforestation would not be happening on such a large scale if there wasn't a demand for things like timber, or a demand for sort of monocultural agricultural techniques. If there wasn't such a demand in certain regions for particular products at such a large scale, then deforestation would sort of naturally stop. And I think that, again, it's just so complex. I don't even really know where to start, but we should work. I don't know, Marion, if you want to kind of jump in on this.
I'll be honest, I was reading the next questions.
Okay. Well, in terms of deforestation in the Amazon, I think that, again, conscious consuming is a really important thing. If you can look at and make sure that things are ethically traded, that they're sustainably sourced. I think that if we can sort of, through consumption, drive demand elsewhere, I think that would be advantageous. But in terms of one single solution, I really don't know. It's such a broad, complex problem.
Yeah, one of the things that people are asking more about on the chat is, what we do as an organization besides these educational seminars, but also somebody wanted us to mention Capitol Hill Days. So I'll just say a little bit about the advocacy that we do is around certain pieces of US legislation that hinder what foreign NGOs that receive US funding can do with those funds, but also with their own funds. And so there are a couple of policies that you may have heard of. One is the Global Gag Rule, and the other one is the Helms Amendment that basically dictates that any foreign NGO that receives US funding cannot provide abortion services or counsel patients on abortion or refer patients to other providers, or advocate for more liberal abortion laws in their own countries. And so what that does in effect is forces clinics, sorry, my phone is ringing, forces clinics to decide whether to accept the US money and curtail the services that they provide or reject the funding, but then often that can lead them to having to shut their doors or to not be able to, purchase supplies or run the mobile outreach clinics that are so important to reaching rural people. So to answer the question about, sort of what we do as an organization to try to, help with this situation, we do advocacy all over the country to try to make sure that people are educated about these policies and to know how important it is that they contact their members of Congress and ask them to support the repeal of both of those policies, so that people in aid recipient countries can get the family planning and contraceptive care that they want and deserve to have. So that's sort of how we as an organization tackle, population stabilization, I guess. I don't know if that answers the question. Capitol Hill Days, that's just we have an annual event in the spring that typically it brings college students mostly from around the country to Washington, D.C., and we spend the weekend training them and then send them up onto Capitol Hill to meet with their members of Congress. And of course, this year it had to be a virtual event. Who knows what's going to happen next year, but it is a great event, and it really gets people engaged in, sort of grassroots advocacy. So just to answer a couple of those questions. Let's see. Somebody's asking, does PopEd have lessons that teach the connection between human behaviors and global impacts? I would say that is what PopEd is. So yes. Hannah, does the UN have a department that focuses on population?
They have they do have the UN, what is it called? The UN
Population Division.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
they come out with a bunch of projections and statistics looking at, the projected population growth into the future, as well as demographic trends that are projected to occur and that have occurred. They provide a lot of really useful information in terms of, where we are right now and where we could potentially go. And one important thing that they do is they look at different projections and they put forth several different possible outcomes based on, if things were to remain the same right now versus if we were to invest very heavily in things like family planning and other developmental innovations like education. And if we were to, institute drastic measures, like if everybody right now were to reduce their fertility rates across the world to 2.1, what would the population look like? So it really paints an important sort of picture in terms of understanding how important what we're doing now is for the future of this planet and for the future of, population growth.
Yeah. And then there's an agency called the United Nations Population Fund. The acronym is UNFPA, which you might notice doesn't match up. The name changed some time ago, but they work on some of these reproductive health issues like the ones that I mentioned. So it's not demography per se or population studies, but more health provision. And they're often the first agency on the ground when like a humanitarian disaster strikes and people need safe delivery kits for, delivering babies and whatnot, and birth control and stuff like that. So the US has not funded UNFPA for the last 3 years, but typically we do send in an annual contribution. Somebody says, girls' education is my vision. We need to do more. I'm sure you would agree with that. Yep. This goes until 3, is that right? Or should I be wrapping up right now?
It's supposed to actually go until, 11:45 my time. So
okay. Okay.
Start to wrap
I mean,
up.
I think we've hit on most of the questions here. Some of them overlap a little bit, and I'll save this chat and we'll make sure that we do written responses to the ones that we didn't get to today, just so that we can let everybody go and stay in time mostly. Yeah, so I guess I'll just thank you, Hannah, for doing such a great presentation and engaging our members in this conversation. Thanks to all of you for joining. Please, if you would like to, okay, where can I find these slides? We will put this all on the website. Let me drop a link into the chat where we have a link on the website for the course, and that's where all of the recorded videos will go and where all of the written responses to the questions will go, and some recommended readings and whatnot. So please visit that. I just put it in the chat. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you next week. What's next week's topic?
Next week, we're going to be looking at the influence that reproductive health has on climate impacts and reducing climate vulnerability. So
okay,
it should be a
great.
nice wrap up.
We have a lot of people interested in that type of stuff based on what people are writing in the chat. So cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone. We'll see you next week. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.